Yeah. Do you want to connect with your phone?
I'm already connected.
Hello, everybody. How's everyone doing? Good? You're a very quiet audience. Hi, I'm Jeremy Boxer. I'm the curator of the immersive experiences here at Sónar+D. To my left is Robin from Marshmallow Laser Feast. He is one of the co-founders and creative director of this immersive experiential studio based out of London. And to his left is Fabien from Fabbula. And Fabbula is a creative practice that is based around the immersive experiences. He represents artists and also runs a think tank based out of Paris. And he's going to be sharing with us some of his insights that he's discovered through his more than 20 years in the digital world. So what we're going to do today is we're going to have both of these gentlemen give you a little 5-minute presentation. And then we have a series of questions and topics that we're going to cover. What I would like to do is, like, as soon as we go into the questions and the conversation, if you do have a burning question, we can then take that. I will look out for you guys, but there are certain topics that we want to hit to make sure that you get the full rounded picture of everything. Okay? Over to you, Robin.
Oh, thanks. Well, firstly, thank you very much, Jeremy, for having us. And it's great to be here. And already just the conversations that we've been having about the state of the industry, about where things are going, have just been insightful just within these walls. So it's an honor to be part of the conversation. In fact, we've got a whole deck of slides lined up that we just want to give you an overview of, just to frame where Marshmallow Laser Feast's journey is, this current state, where we're going, as well as the industry in general, thanks to the font of knowledge to my left, Fabien. If you want to unleash, should we do this?
Sure. Yeah, with pleasure. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Sónar, for having me here today. It's quite special because, as Jeremy mentioned, I've been dabbling in this digital technology for about as long as Sónar exists. I remember as a kid being a DJ, I wanted to come here. So now I don't come as a DJ, but more as somebody involved with VR. And VR is at this stage where we're about 4 years after the launch of the first Oculus, and with it a huge hype coming from people selling headsets, people investing in people selling headsets. And 4 years down, we've seen this hype go perhaps bust, or at least on a lower level. And so the question remains now as to what is VR in 2019 and what is interesting us in the field of VR in 2019. So to answer that question, we've prepared a few highlights as to where our interests lied in the past year. So I want to talk to you about one thing in particular, which is, if that's working, which is a new, and this has been much talked about, a new way to tell stories. So you're aware of this. For people who came here, see the selection that's amazing, and it's shown right behind here. You can see a new type of stories and new ways to tell stories. There's one particular trend that's developing in this world is stories to observe. So you're basically on a higher ground and you're looking at a small set where characters that big go around and have a story. And you can observe it from different points of view. Now this is an interesting trend that's been pioneered by companies like Fabbula and retaken by this experience here, Gloomy Eyes, that's presented at the back. So that's one thing. It's okay. Oh wow, yeah. More bass. Thank you. Right. So that was one trend I wanted to share with you. Another one is quite exciting also. It is stories that basically have you participate in. And in the field of immersive theater, right now there's a growing trend in embracing VR as a device that the audience can wear, and actors around you will basically play a theater play, having you at the center of it. and that is a very interesting trend. This is images from Divi, who did an Alice in Wonderland inspired play last year, and did a new one here, the horrifically real virtuality, which has more people into this experience.
Describe a little bit about that experience so people can understand the difference in that.
Sure. So basically, this one, for example, you get prepared with headsets and backpack PCs. You get into a room that at first, basically you can't see physically, you can only see it through your headsets. And here you will start to hear voices in your headset, and you will start to see avatars that looks pretty realistic, not in the sense of photorealistic, but more in expressions, animations. And in fact, most of these avatars are manned by actors. That's the one that we saw just before. You can see that this actor is basically having all these facial expressions tracked by this camera, and that is beaming live into the rabbit character right here. So what you see in headset is the rabbit. What you hear is the actor, and you can have his physical presence as well as his real live acting in front of you. So it's extremely powerful. You have basically a whole bunch of actors around you playing for you a story. Going with the collective experience is also, this is a work that Robin and his crew has been creating. We Live in the Ocean of Air. It was presented this year for 6 months at the Statue Gallery in London. I had a chance to go there twice. And this is an experience to be done with 6 people together, and you can see each other, you can interact with one another. And this is something that's also heightening the sense of experience, because not only you're having a great immersive experience on your own, but you can also share this and see how it's embraced by others. This is also a growing trend, especially when we think of the early days of VR, where people would think this is an isolating experience, this is for people alone in the bedrooms. Not really. Actually, where things are at right now is in the public space, and mostly as a shared experience that you can do with your family and friends. Another thing I wanted to share with you is this idea of sandbox that is evolving into an art form. This is a piece by Mélodie Mousset, an artist who's coming from contemporary art background. She exhibited in contemporary art museums in Los Angeles, in Switzerland, in Asia, and so on. And now, for the last few years, she's been working on a gaming piece that uses gaming engines, where you arrive in there and it's a whole desert, and the users themselves create all these hands that you can see here, chains of hands, and the whole lot of interactions and building blocks that you can unleash. So basically, you're making the piece. You're just proposing a framework in which you're acting. This is something that is common in gaming fields, not so much in the artistic field, where there's been this traditional idea of authorship and people basically guiding you through an experience. So very interesting field as well. Another one is, this is the images from Reanimated, a work that is right now quite successfully being exhibited pretty much everywhere in the world by this Danish artist called Jacob Stinson. And Jacob basically created a matrix experience in Unreal gaming engine that was first a virtual reality piece. So the idea is to reanimate a bird that is extinct. So that's, and then he built a poem around it. And he did this VR experience, but then he started to do an AR experience. And then he got invited by the Serpentine to do a sculpture in the park, and then a video, and so on and so on. So this is interesting for artists today, is this idea of creating a matrix of experiences that then can be output in a variety of formats and experiences. Another thing I wanted to share with you are art forms or immersive art that embrace today contemporary topics. So of course, We've seen works by Jacob, for example, very much post-Anthropocene artwork. But there are other contemporary themes, such as this one by John Ruffman, that basically propose you to be in a location, in this case, the Boston Museum, and have this experience of being submerged by a tsunami. And so this is, of course, much more onirical and ambiguous than it sounds. But it's this idea that the VR medium, the immersive medium, is really well suited to the challenge of our times. And this is also where there's a lot of interesting things to be observed. We want to talk to you also, and that's something that we kind of note, the three of us, is that there's more and more talents coming into immersive, and that talent is coming from everywhere, not just schools or traditional grounds where you can get educated into VR, but also from people in their garage. This shot is extract from a work by Alpha Rats and Vlad Storm, two underground artists working in Berlin, producing their work at night and doing really amazing things with basically Unity and a computer. The next one is the sense of touch that's been developing. We've seen a lot of visual-centric experiences in the past. Lately, there have been a lot more scent. We've been a lot more, how do you say, gustative sense when you eat something.
Taste?
Taste, thank you very much. So, and touch as well. Here is a view of an experience that as natural gesture, you don't have controllers anymore. You can forget about which buttons you have to click. You simply touch with your hands a sort of suspended garden. And this is an increasing trend, basically also for the users to be able to control very accurately what's happening in the world. Once we have an increase in agency, that's how people call this act of having control over the environment, the more immersive, the more interesting the experiences become. Those are the few of the trends. There are many more. I have this kind of keywords laden slide. I'm sorry if that sounds very hard to grasp, but basically VR, in my opinion, is exploring a lot of new ways, not just ways inherited from cinema, from video games, from other forms of art, but also its own. And I've attempted to list a few here that basically where I think VR is well suited. And that's just the beginning, because the road, it's quite interesting and goes in the dark.
Cool.
Over to you, Robin.
Thanks. I just want to do a quick survey. How many of you do VR at home every day? Ooh, an incredible show of hands there. The reason why I asked that question is essentially we've realized that at this point in time, in terms of the state of VR, it's still in its early stages. It's expensive, and that's a barrier, but it's also expensive to produce as well. So is AR. And in terms of framing our background, I'll talk over this music, but our creative studio has been focused on immersive. We've been looking at interactive lights, we've been looking at interactive lasers, robotics, fabrication, physical things, as well as virtual things, and looking at how they interact. We've been collaborating with musicians. This was with Ronatrix Point Never. We work with a wide range of collaborators and skill sets, and I think our practice reflects any kind of international city at the moment, because there's channels into the work that have game developers, architects, designers that are coming through our doors, and we're just working with them to make these immersive experiences. And we're not so bothered about it being just VR. We're bothered about stories, as everyone is, to make sure that the audience engages with our work in a different way, in a way that is hopefully topical, compelling. And we've decided to kind of channel our work in ways. I'm going to go quite quickly and skim over some things, but channel our focus to make sure that the sensibilities within the studio are executed and delivered in so they reflect our own ideals. So lots of our work is nature-based. Lots of our work is prompting conversations about the natural world and the use of the Earth's resources, but bringing that conversation into an artistic environment as well. And we try and do that in ways that's non-verbal, in the case of the film that you just saw, but also, like, increasingly, we're realizing the power of using multisensory. And so in the case of the slide that Fabien showed slightly earlier, you know, shedding light on the fundamental connection between animal and plant in ways that not necessarily can be achieved with a traditional film, not necessarily can be realized in a painting. We can take people into paintings. We can allow people to see their breath using sensors. We can allow people to have other mechatronic input devices like heart sensors that we bring into a shared context. In the case of this project, we've learned a heck of a lot that we'll get onto further, in that we've realized, wow, audiences are actually really interested in engaging in this location-based work. So VR location-based work, where it's a spectacle, where they can go for a day without having to buy lots of expensive equipment and lose themselves in an experience in an engaging way with strangers, with families. And in the case of Ocean of Air, we started off in the Saatchi Gallery for 6 weeks, which sold out and was extended for 6 months. And in that time, we've learned how to really manage these and grow and be proactive in terms of the industry, be proactive in terms of, like, this is the way that we want audiences to engage. This is the way that we collaborate with galleries, with museums, with spaces on how this new immersive work should be framed. Because a lot of the time it's framed in quite kind of techie, male geek, zeitgeisty, slightly lawnmower man-esque. But it's important to look for efficiencies within our practice. And what we've realized is where we make investments in emotional energy as well as creative energy and financial, where to take risks and how to see how they can be primed in order to get the most out of the energy put in. So Sweet Dreams is a work in progress where we're using the same equipment, untethered VR backpacks and headsets, allowing people to walk around spaces and see each other, and use multisensory tech. In the case of Sweet Dreams, people eat and people drink. And working with our network to then be able to fabricate things that can accommodate large audiences. In the case of Sweet Dreams, we're developing the work which we intend it to be a 90-minute experience, not always in VR, but it's working out ways of how to allow audiences through, how much to charge for tickets, and how long people will sustain in VR whilst engaging with the work. And so there's lots of learning on the job, and there's lots of risk. The other thing in terms of Sweet Dreams and other immersive experiences we're creating is we're realizing as the technology advances, you know, we'll in the case of this, we're tracking people's feet, tracking people's hands, and with that, we're able to be creative and allow for these shared experiences to come about. And, you know, of course, a couple of years ago, this was incredibly hard to do, and I think we'll look back nostalgically at these heavy backpacks and clunky headsets in terms of moving with the times and learning how to work with tracking technology. There's also ways in which we've realized how immersive storytelling can present new opportunities for writers. So we're working with the BFI, the British Film Institute, to work out how a story world can exist and have a location-based experience, but then have windows into that story via mobiles, via at-home headsets, and via things like AR too. And there's also new aesthetics developing as graphics cards improve, as computer game authoring software like Unreal and Unity evolve. This is just a quick overview of how branching narratives and how we plan for these kind of things to be set up. But overall, we're just still really excited, and we still realize that we're on rung one of the ladder, and we feel really confident with what we've been in terms of ticket sales, in terms of the way in which the trajectory of the industry is going. And I'm excited to talk a little further about this. And along the way, we develop techniques, know-how, and capabilities to allow us to then exploit things commercially as well. Sweet Dreams uses flavor. In the case of this, just for an example of one of the scenes, people literally drink the sun out of the universe and taste ginger and Szechuan pepper as they go. And so we're playing with scale, we're playing with flavor perception, as well as story. And essentially that leads to critical lines of inquiry and R&D. And I mentioned authoring VR work is really expensive. Communication and shared knowledge is also critical. And so we're undergoing a deep dive 2-year research project with the Royal Shakespeare Company, with Punch Drunk, an immersive theatre company, with Magic Leap, Intel, London Philharmonic, this whole cluster where it culminates in a final showcase. But more than anything else, it gleans where the obstacles are, where the major problems are, where the efficiencies are, and how we can work with institutions to stage work as well. And that's I often describe it like a 30-legged race. You know, everyone's legs are tied together, and so our legs are tied to the computer game software authoring tools such as Unity, as well as the graphics cards, as well as the cultural institutions, the curators, the venues that will house this. Of course, it doesn't make any sense at all if there's only 4 places to house Marshmallow Laser Feast's work. Well, that's great, but that's not an industry. That's lucky Marshmallow Laser Feast. And so what we're trying to do is work collectively to work out how university courses, institutions, we can sculpt an industry that celebrates all the creativity and potential creativity that can be unlocked. And that leads to the next note, really.
So basically, we're going to rewind a little bit. And I wanted to talk to you, Robin, about like how do you fund your projects? I mean, you clearly have these very experimental and projects that really push the boundaries in terms of storytelling in one way or another for immersive experiences. Do you have to do a balance between commercial and personal work?
Indeed, we do. We, at this point in time, bootstrap our work. So lots of the IP that we're generating and touring, it has to be paid for. And so we work with creative producers. We're fortunate in the UK that there's tax breaks, that there's things like the Arts Council that are part of the picture, but that means that, in fact, we have to work harder to collaborate with institutions. You know, one of the risks and one of the kind of so-called boundary-pushing elements is convincing traditional galleries to house immersive work. You know, there's lots of reputation embedded in these venues, and just the act of getting through the door and getting an understanding on the curatorial base is a major boundary to broach and to breach. But we also try and be efficient with the work that we've developed, in that we essentially use our artistic work in the commercial industry to do adverts, experiences, and so on. And we feel that we can bring a fresh voice into that area as well. And importantly, new skills, new R&D, new and finance.
So what was your experience with working with a Saatchi Gallery? How did you convince them?
The way in which we engage with any organization is always unique, and there's lots of hoops to jump through and lots of trust to be won. Essentially, we believe in if the work's decent, if the work stands up on its own, then we feel that we're in a position now to understand how we can frame our work and how we can present our work in the way that we really want it to be experienced.
Fabien, are there other ways that people that you've found through your think tank that are funding their works? Can you talk a little bit about how things are going in France and other places?
Yeah, I can talk from the perspective of France, where I am the most active. France has a kind of wonderful mechanics called the CNC, pretty similar to an organism in Canada as well that fund the film industry. So basically, any film that gets sold in France gets taxed a little bit, and that goes into a pool of money that is distributed to people doing local French cinema. Out of this system, for about 10 years now, the CNC has been funding new media. It was called transmedia first, and then for the last 5 years, mostly VR. And there's a whole bunch of production companies and studio that have a big debt to that system, basically. Atlas, for example, Lucid, Divi Group, all these companies, some of it I referenced earlier, have been funded thanks to the CNC and its kind of broadcasting counterpart Arte. Now, having said that, there is not a single work that CNC will finance where it is the only financer. So it is always about bridging the gap between a private entity or another government fund from abroad. So what we find out is that, in the last 3 years, CNC has invested 10 million euros, which is a pretty hefty sum, but that corresponds to about 40 to 50 million worth of production money, because the rest came from Oculus, came from Taiwan, came from Canada, Brazil, private partners, and so on. So most of these productions have a very diverse round of investors and promoters. So this is what we've seen, and the French have had to go out extensively in festivals, markets, to find co-producers.
So, speaking from the Americans' perspective, there is no government funding for any works in America. We are wholly dependent on either private investors or technology companies or technology platforms to fund these kinds of projects. And then there's the outside of that, then it's working with brands and the blend of those two. Recently, the headset manufacturers have slowed down in their fundings of that they were doing in the past couple of years. But coming up are mobile companies who are looking at 5G and who are looking at other ways of exploring funding in that way. But Robin, you went to see Meowwolf recently, and they're kind of doing something a little bit different. Can you tell everybody a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was interesting because obviously we have lots of friends who are operating in America, and they often refer to the privileged situation of being a Brit or a Dane or someone from France, where there's this helping hand on the public funding side. But it was interesting to see that the kind of gold rush mentality of people like Meowwolf, that I think it's encouraging in that their ability to generate funds. I don't know if you know the full story, but they've commanded an extraordinary amount of investment with the help of George R.R. Martin, the author of Game of Thrones, and so on, with a very strategic focus on nurturing the immersive industry in terms of a Vegas location, a location in Denver, one in Washington, D.C., and beyond. And hundreds of millions of dollars are being invested in that infrastructure. And I found it really quite insightful. I found it incredibly American in the kind of full-fat mega blaster. But it was also quite interesting that in a scenario where there is an absence of public funding, where there's a will, there's a way, and they've certainly managed to generate a lot of interest and a lot of investment. And from our perspective, we see that in terms of the barometer of immersive. We see it as a very confident step forward to say VR, XR, the immersive sector is healthy. There's going to be lots more of this going on in the future.
So we're going to move to the risks of pushing boundaries. I mean, like in terms of most of your work, you guys are always pushing the boundaries of how you do things. How do you manage that risk, you know, and how do you balance that out when you're going out there?
We've talked about the fact that anyone in this industry that's making VR at the moment, in an artistic context, in a slightly filmic or story-based context, they're up against a lot of obstacles. And in terms of the risks, what is challenging is that lots of the risks are on the maker. Lots of the risks are on the independent studios. And so in the case of Marshmallow Laser Feast, for example, there's lots of emotional risks, lots of kind of financial risks that are huge that in the future I think will be offset by institutions. As the industry beds in, we're hoping that instead of this bottom-up, independent, essentially we're just, by hook or by crook, we focus on realizing our work to the standard that we really believe audiences should be engaging in it. And so in the case of Marshmallow Laser Feast, there's a kind of die-hard ethos to just get the work into the world, get it out of our heads and into the world. But if you're speaking to someone on a university course, or you're speaking to a peer at a studio that's having to pay, 30 people in an office, you need financial business models. You need a sustainable structure in order to make this an industry, not just folly. And so that's where we think dialogue is hugely important, and recognizing that there's a codependence on all the creators to put pressure on the institutions, as well as work with funding bodies, whether they're private or public, to allow the creative work to flourish, but also to find efficiencies. So a venue that invests in a sound system can accommodate 20, 200 entities providing installation work as opposed to bespoke each time.
Fabien, can you speak a little bit about that too, in terms of maybe speaking about the importance of data in terms of mitigating risk from an investor's point of view?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I come from a background of being a video games producer. Video gaming is a very mature industry, and as a producer, all you do is Excel crunching, basically. So you model, because you have a trove of data, historic data. You can go back to retail sales, online indicators, and so on. In VR, we have none of that. There is no model. To me, this is the beauty of it. That model is to be invented, is being invented by each and every MLF creator out there who's basically having a new form, a new proposition. So that doesn't mean that there needs to be over naivety into the sector, of course. But that means that financiers, investors, producers don't have a clear visibility into creative work yet, and they won't constrain creators with modeling. So that's a first point. The second is that as creative work through how to make a work that is sustainable, they usually have a lot of common sense in there that I find very valuable. I've seen some of these models and some of the very hard ones, such as performing arts, for example. Performing arts, when you think of it, is a bunch of actors or dancers that are playing something for a small group of people. So in terms of economies of scale, it's a disaster, right? As compared to a cinema experience or even a dance show that can be attended by 5,000 people at once. So obviously this is not optimized yet, but this is obvious and no one is unaware of that. What people are aware is that they need to go from point A to point B, and the ways that they are looking at it through the help of online multiplayer, AI, 5G, using the text to basically make these models work, it's quite amazing. So to me, and this is something that also dates back from my video gaming world, is first you have to have the, what we call content stickiness. It's not a pretty word, but that means that people get attracted to a content, they want more of it, they want to go to the searchy, they want to go to an immersive play, they want to have this kind of experience. And this, we know that the appetite is very, very high right now. Immersive has become the new buzzword everywhere. Immersive this, immersive that. And that shows the appreciation of experiential things and propositions that are there. So from that stickiness, you build repetition. From that repetition, you build a first stream of revenue that can grow and so on and so on. So one thing at a time. And that's the big lesson for the last 4 years, I think, and it's the same with many tech cycles, is no rush. Start with the creation and the content. Once there is a certainty that something is interesting for a large number of people, then you can build on it. I think that 4 years ago there was this, massive desire for it to work instantly, and that as soon as there is an iPhone on the table, then suddenly there's 5 billion smartphones from one day to another. It's not happening. It's not happening like that. So it's taking a bit of time, but I think we're on the right track right now.
There's lots of investment. There's so much investment in hardware, and what is extraordinary is that each year the production values are soaring. And so, you mentioned 4 years ago we were seeing very basic VR experiences, and they're increasingly getting so much more cinematic, so much more complex, and accessible in terms of the means in which the cost of these headsets are gradually coming down. So there's so many moving parts, and to be a practitioner making work, it's knowing when to invest in equipment as well, because as soon as you've bought the equipment, there's a new headset out, or there's a new graphics card out, and so on. So there's an inordinate amount of risks, but I think as the industry matures, collectively, we certainly, in terms of our peers, have conversations about strategic authoring of content that can live on beyond the headset of the day.
So we're going to have time for about 1 or 2 questions. If there aren't questions, we have a lot more to talk about. Are there any questions in the audience first? Going once?
Yeah.
No? Okay. We're going to skip ahead in a few to talk about where this is all headed. That's better. I'd like you guys to talk a little bit about where you think we were talking about how immersive experiences is the new buzzword, and can you talk a little bit about what you guys think we're going to?
From my perspective, I was fortunate to meet some of the Endless team that are here developing a kind of Instagram for music. They're making an app, and we had a long discussion about the way in which it's more of the journey as opposed to the destination, the different ways in which users, the different ways in which audiences are behaving and engaging in material. And sometimes this is on a kind of snack-based, sometimes this is fully immersive. And from our perspective, a holistic authoring is really important in order to create an immersive experience that is multisensory, that involves scent, touch, sight, sound, as well as multiple people in multiple locations. There's also the consideration that with 5G, with improved networks, that geographic constraints aren't a factor anymore. And so creating experiences can embrace remote interaction as well. And so there's really quite fascinating opportunities to create genuinely new connections with people, but also new forms of creative expression. And for me, that's where it is particularly exciting in that nobody can predict the success of something like Snapchat, which is just perplexing in the way that so many people engage with it, and so much technology is being drilled into these kind of snack elements. But what we're going to see is these kind of augmentations are going to meet with the real world as well, and so that mixed reality crossover and creating experiences where, whether it's a gig, whether it's a film, we've been conditioned to think that our act of escapism is go to a film, go to another silo, gaming, go to the theatre. And essentially, these siloed, compartmentalized, fixed entities and institutions are starting to blur dramatically. And with that, that's going to cultivate new types of audience behavior. And that'll really dictate where it all goes.
Do you have any final thoughts, Fabien?
Yeah, I think, it's hard for me to comment in general terms as to what the future is. But two things I'd like to mention. First is the newfound interest from the contemporary arts sector into VR. It's something that I kind of thought about a few years ago, but never thought it would realize that much. Basically, the hypothesis is that artists are very well equipped to create and provide experiences. That's basically the material that they very often use for their own output, whatever it is. And so creating these synesthesias, these sensorial experiences is very well adapted to VR. And the art world took its time, but basically now as dedicated venues, programs, commissions to allow artists to use the VR medium. I'd cite one, for example, in France we have this contemporary art museum called Palais de Tokyo. It's kind of a leading institution for us. And they've now opened a permanent space for virtual reality art that presents two works in big rooms, about 150 square meter each, and on works that they commission to artists that they follow or they want to enable. And this is an example of a venue that is really kind of high art going into VR. So Robin mentioned Sachi, this Palais Tokyo, and now you can see this popping up pretty much everywhere. So that's something interesting that I think will change the perception of VR for a lot of people. Another trend that I wanted to mention is what's the use of virtual reality. In a sense, there's a lot of ways to be found to replace physical activities. It's as simple as that. And in an era where physical transportation, physical consumption is getting more and more problematic, virtual will probably step in and say, you don't need to take that flight to go to that meeting. How about you do it virtually? You don't need to go all the way around the globe to check that exhibition, even if it's super interesting, or that concert, and so on. And you can use virtual to do this. It sounds simple. I don't know how fast or if really it's going to materialize, but certainly this is something that virtual has a lot to bring on.
Well, I wanted to thank our two panelists, Robin and Fabien, and since you are all physically here, I encourage you to go to check out some of the immersive installations down there, on the next level down there. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.